In every major institutional failure, there is a moment when someone knew. A warning was written, a report was filed, a pattern was identified, and yet nothing changed. Institutions rarely fail because they lack information. They fail because they gradually redefine what counts as a threat. Today, we examine the quiet process that turns warning into background noise and risk into routine. This is Shadow Archives. Every collapse appears sudden when viewed from the outside. A financial system destabilizes. An intelligence assessment proves catastrophically wrong. A regulatory framework fails to prevent predictable misconduct. In hindsight, the signs seem obvious. Analysts point to early signals. Journalists uncover archived warnings. Committees reconstruct timelines. But institutional failure rarely begins with blindness. It begins with reinterpretation. Warnings enter organizations as anomalies, an unexpected data correlation, a field officer questioning assumptions, a compliance metric drifting outside tolerance, a structural dependency becoming fragile. At first, anomalies disrupt consensus. They challenge models. They demand attention. But institutions are not designed for permanent disruption. They are designed for continuity. So the anomaly is processed. Processing does not mean resolution. It means translation. Critical vulnerability becomes manageable exposure. Escalating instability becomes temporary variance. Systemic risk becomes low-probability scenario. No deception is required. No conspiracy is necessary. Language softens because language stabilizes. Stability is prized because stability is measurable. Markets reward it. Political systems depend on it. Leadership legitimacy often rests upon it. Each time a warning is reframed instead of confronted, the baseline shifts. The first deviation triggers alarm. The second triggers review. The third triggers monitoring. The fourth triggers documentation. Eventually, the deviation triggers nothing at all. The organization has not eliminated the risk. It has absorbed it. Absorbed risk loses contrast. Without contrast, urgency fades. This is how anomaly becomes environment, how warning becomes background, how institutions learn to live with signals that once demanded correction, and once risk becomes familiar, it becomes normal. Normalization does not advance through language alone. It advances through incentives. Inside any complex institution, behavior aligns with reward structures. Executives are promoted for preserving operational stability. Managers are evaluated on predictable performance. Analysts are encouraged to provide balanced assessments rather than destabilizing conclusions. Repeated escalation carries reputational cost. An individual who consistently identifies structural risk may be respected, but they are also perceived as disruptive. Over time, professionals calibrate their assessments, not out of dishonesty, out of adaptation. If raising alarms leads to budget scrutiny, political friction, or slowed advancement, alarm frequency decreases. Warnings become probabilistic, conclusions become conditional, recommendations become incremental, risk remains, its presentation evolves. At the same time, institutional fragmentation obscures systemic exposure. Large organizations divide responsibility across departments, divisions, and oversight layers. Each unit monitors its domain. Each tracks its metrics. Each believes adjacent units are managing related threats. But structural risk rarely respects boundaries. It spreads horizontally. It compounds across silos. It links isolated weaknesses into integrated fragility. Because accountability remains vertical, no single authority sees the full trajectory. Every department appears compliant. Every metric appears within tolerance. Every oversight mechanism appears functional. Local stability masks systemic drift. Drift is gradual. It rarely triggers crisis thresholds. Standards adjust subtly. Tolerance widens incrementally. Temporary exceptions become procedural norms. The organization does not collapse. It recalibrates. Each recalibration feels reasonable in isolation. Together they redefine normality. When normality shifts, early warning signals lose sharpness. And when warning signals lose sharpness, institutions stop reacting. They begin adapting instead. Adaptation is efficient. It allows continuity. But adaptation to structural weakness compounds vulnerability. What feels like resilience may be accommodation, and accommodation is the architecture of slow decline. The most dangerous phase of institutional failure is not initial warning. It is prolonged stability after repeated warning. Because nothing catastrophic has occurred, confidence strengthens. If the threat were truly severe, consequences would already be visible. This reasoning feels rational. It is structurally flawed. Complex systems degrade gradually. Stress accumulates beneath visible performance. Redundancies weaken without immediate collapse. Decision pathways lengthen. Signal clarity deteriorates. Surface indicators remain acceptable. Operations continue. Reports circulate. Meetings proceed. Stability becomes evidence of health. But endurance without reform is not resilience. It is delayed consequence. Each cycle of survival reinforces the belief that the system can tolerate further strain. Past endurance becomes predictive confidence. Confidence reshapes inquiry. Instead of asking whether foundational conditions are eroding, leadership asks whether present metrics remain within acceptable bounds. Performance replaces integrity as the measure of success. This cultural shift is subtle but profound. New employees enter an environment already recalibrated. They inherit adjusted thresholds. They never experience the original standard. What once triggered escalation now triggers review. What once triggered review now triggers documentation. What once triggered documentation now triggers routine acceptance. Drift becomes policy. Policy becomes expectation. Expectation becomes identity. At this stage, decisive reform appears disruptive. Disruption threatens hierarchy. Hierarchy prioritizes continuity. Committees advise incremental modification. Oversight bodies recommend further monitoring. Leadership emphasizes patience and measured response. Incrementalism preserves narrative stability. But incremental response to structural fragility compounds risk. When eventual collapse arrives, it appears abrupt. In reality, it is the culmination of tolerated deviation. The crisis is not the origin, it is the revelation of accumulated accommodation. Preventing this pattern requires institutions to embed structural friction. Healthy systems elevate anomalies instead of neutralizing them. They formalize dissent. They protect contrarian analysis. They reward long-term trajectory assessment over short-term reassurance. Most importantly, they separate institutional identity from performance optics. When identity depends on appearing stable, stability becomes the objective. When identity depends on structural integrity, correction becomes imperative. This distinction determines whether adaptation strengthens or weakens resilience. Trajectory thinking asks, if current patterns persist, where do they lead? Incident thinking asks, is the present disturbance survivable? Institutions constrained by electoral cycles, quarterly reporting pressures, or reputational sensitivity default to incident thinking. Long-term correction rarely produces immediate visible reward. Short-term reassurance does. So reassurance dominates. Language stabilizes perception. Metrics soften volatility. Exceptions become procedural until reassurance fails. Understanding institutional failure requires rejecting the myth of sudden collapse. Collapse is rarely spontaneous. It is cumulative. Language softened, thresholds widened, warnings reframed, responsibility diffused. By the time breakdown becomes visible, the organization has already adapted to diminished standards for years. The visible crisis is not the beginning of failure. It is confirmation of normalization. Institutions do not typically fail because they are unaware. They fail because they become comfortable. Comfort with adjusted expectations. Comfort with incremental drift. Comfort with adaptation over correction. And comfort, once institutionalized, is extraordinarily resistant to reversal. This was Shadow Archives.